a lot of people are very reluctant to engage in conversations about it, to engage in activities related to it. And you know, to me that's very sad, but it's very understandable as well. I mean, I understand exactly why. I've been doing talks related to this subject since 2002, but it's something that I've been interested in since I was a teenager in high school. I can remember I used to have this briefcase when I was in high school, this old raggedy briefcase. I don't even know where I got it from. But I kept a lot of stuff in it. You know, awards that I won in high school, you know, honor roll, perfect attendance, stuff like that. I was on the school newspaper my junior and senior year, so I kept articles that I've written in that old briefcase. And I was going through it a number of years ago, just you know, let me kind of look at where I was at such a young age. Where was my mind at that time? And I went through it and I was looking at all of these things that I had written, and you know, nothing really interesting in terms of the articles I wrote for the school paper. I think I wrote an article about the chess team. I was a member of the chess team in school. I wrote an article about that, and just some stuff that was very bland. But I came across this little picture that I had drawn, and I didn't remember drawing this picture, but it was a picture I drew, and the picture was of two hands grasping like this. One hand was black and one was white, and underneath it said 1955. I started thinking, 1955. Oh, the Montgomery bus boycott, kind of one of the starts of the civil rights movement, one of the events that spearheaded all of these things that came after it. And I realized that even back at that time, even though I didn't really remember it, I guess I was interested in this type of work even back at that time. And I had written something on the back of it about wanting to start an organization to bring people together. I was in high school. I don't know what I was thinking about, but somehow that was in my mind even as a kid, and I completely forgotten about it. I was somehow disconnected from that, and I don't know how I got disconnected from realizing that I was thinking along those lines even back at that time, but apparently I was. So this stuff, I always tell people, it's in my blood. It's in me as a person because of the circumstances that I was born under. I don't know if I've mentioned this to the group or not. I was born in a little town called Charleston, Mississippi, Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and I got here a little early, and I was looking over here, and they have all of these census books and whatnot, and so I looked up the 1965 census, the year I was born, and I looked up Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and I looked up the number of live births. There were 574 people born in Tallahatchie County in 1965. I was one of those 574, so it actually makes me feel kind of special. And so when I was born, the hospital I was born in, Tallahatchie County General Hospital, the only hospital in town. Charleston is the county seat of Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, and each county seat has a big courthouse. And they kind of have a big circular street around the courthouse. And in front of each one of those, they have a big, huge statue about maybe 15 feet tall of a Confederate soldier. And that's in the county seat of every single county in Mississippi. It's a memorial to the Confederate soldiers lost in the Civil War. And it's a part of Mississippi history. And in addition to that, at the time that I was being born, the hospital was still a segregated hospital. So when my mother went into labor that afternoon, and she finally made it to the hospital with some assistance, we had to go around to the back door, to the colored only entrance of the hospital. We weren't allowed to go into the front door. And you know, so I always tell people that I came into the world dealing with racism and didn't even realize it. And so the knowledge of that, it has kind of impacted why I do the work that I do, and why I think along the lines that I think, because I think it's extremely important. There's a lot of stuff that we can do as individuals in terms of anti-racism work. There's a lot of groups that do work along these lines. some local groups that have done some work that I was just speaking to someone about earlier. And you know, these groups that have been working on these issues, they've been around for a long time. I mean, the abolitionists were kind of, to a certain extent, working along those lines back in the 1800s. The NAACP, the Urban League, Anti-Defamation League, a variety of different groups over the years have been doing this type of work. And as I look at it and I ask, you know, what real impact does it make? And I think overall, it's only made a small impact on racism. I think that racism is still a very powerful force in our society, unfortunately, and it's going to continue to be a very powerful force moving forward for the foreseeable future, based on the way things are going. However, I think that the real work, when you look at those groups, you have to look at the impact that those groups that do this type of work, the impact that those groups have on those individuals that are doing the work itself. Those are the people that it has the true impact on. Those are the people that are open-minded enough to actually recognize racism as this thing that they want to get rid of in some capacity or want to fight against, and it really is very impactful on their lives. It may not necessarily be impactful on the lives of lots and lots of people. When it's impactful on your life in particular, it has the ability to be impactful on the life of people that you're close to, friends, family members, co-workers, people of that nature. So I think that's the real power of anti-racism work. I don't think that there's enough that can be done simply because of the size of racism that it can make racism go away. I don't think that's something that's even manageable. However, it is manageable on a kind of a person-to-person level, to kind of do something positive moving forward towards it. And so the type of work that you do will be based on your perspective. If you're a victim of racism, you know, you're a person that you're tired of dealing with it, and you need some help. You can't do it alone. You need somebody to help you do the work. If you're a bystander, and the people that I call bystanders are a majority of white Americans are bystanders. You know, when we think of racism, we typically think white people are racist, but a majority of people are bystanders. People that stand by and they witness racism. They see it, they ignore it, they're afraid to fight against it, they're afraid to speak out against it. So that's a very large group of people in America, bystanders, people that are simply there and they witness it. They don't necessarily participate in it. Sometimes the organizations or institutions that they're part of are part of the way racism works, but they're really bystanders. They don't have control over the institutions. So in a lot of cases, they're tired of witnessing it. They don't like to see those things, and they want to figure out some way of helping. And so they join racism organizations. And then there are people who are admitted racists, and they've gotten to the point where they want to make a change in their life. They want to do something different. And so those are the three perspectives I think that we have to look at. And regardless of which one of those you belong to, it doesn't really make a difference. The work that's required is different depending on which group you belong to. The work is completely different. The reason I say that, let's just look at it at a specific type of situation. In New York City for many, many years, probably I'd say 7, 8 years, maybe longer than I can't remember, but they had this policy, the New York Police Department has a policy called Stop and Frisk. And over the course of these years, they would keep very good statistics on who they would stop and who they would frisk and what the results of those stops and frisks were. And so that was a very closely guarded secret for many years. The New York Police Department didn't put that information out, but there were people that wanted to know, because people complained that it was racially motivated, that it was determined to find something in Black and Hispanic males and ignoring other people. So when the numbers finally came out and people looked at it, they said, well, a majority of the people by far that have been stopped and frisked have been Black and Hispanic males, usually young, well over 1 million a year. Imagine that. Well over 1 million a year are stopped and frisked not because of a crime that they committed, but because they look suspicious. So you have over 1 million people stopped and frisked simply because of the way they look. The way they look is something that they have absolutely no control over. So they are obviously the victims of it. Obviously, there are people that are walking past when these young men are stopped. Sometimes they may be with a group of white friends, and they get pulled over by the police or stopped by the police walking down the street. They'll stop and frisk the black and Hispanics, but not the whites. So here you have this group of whites who are bystanders, and sometimes they are stop and frisk as well, but in very, very small numbers as compared to the other groups. And so here's a person who's a bystander who wants to do something, but what can they really do? Nothing. And then you have some people who are racist, and they'll look at it, and for many years they'll support it and say, you know, it's a good crime fighting measure. But then when the numbers come out, when the statistics come out in terms of what they find on the people when they stop and frisk them, in terms of drugs or guns, which is primarily what they're looking for, they found that whites were way more likely to have guns, way more likely to have drugs than the blacks or the Hispanics. And for blacks and Hispanic people, it didn't come as a surprise. We know that, you know, we're not going to be dumb enough to walk around with guns or drugs. Even if we have them, we're not going to be dumb enough to walk around. But whites feel very comfortable doing it because they don't expect the police to stop and frisk them. It's something that's out of the ordinary for them. So there's a situation where, depending on which particular perspective you have, how do you deal with stop and frisk? You deal with it on a different level. So as a victim, you want to fight to end that system. As a bystander, in many instances you may think, well, you know, it's bad, but you know, it's the law and I'm going to support the law enforcement and blah, blah, blah. So you may have mixed feelings about it. And a racist who isn't necessarily ready to change yet, says, no, we still need to use it. It's still a good tool because we still capture some people, so and so and so forth. So the perspective you have has a lot to do in terms of the work that you will do in terms of anti-racism work. So I don't usually like to make assumptions, as I learned many years ago, when you make assumptions, you make a ASS out of you in front of me. And so, but I feel very comfortable making the assumption that since you guys are here and have been here consistently over the past several weeks, that you are interested in some capacity in anti-racism work. So we're going to talk about some of the things that can be done. There are a number of steps, very basic steps that we can take to fight racism. Step one, to acknowledge it. That seems like a very simple step. But for most Americans, that's like a large leap of faith. People do not want to believe that racism is this force that's so powerful. Many people have led themselves to believe that we live in what's called a colorblind America. That, you know, we have a black president now, we have, you know, Oprah Winfrey and Bill Cosby, and they name all of these successful black people, and that's a sign to some people that we've come a long way, and that, you know, we're dividing ourselves for no reason. However, this is the point I always make. When I talk to people about Barack Obama's presidency and him being president proving that we're in a post-racial America, it's a lie. And I'll tell you why it's a lie. If you do the math, you'll see it's a lie. The assumption behind the idea of a post-racial America being defined by the fact that we have a black president. First of all, one of his parents is black and one of his parents is white, which a lot of people made a big deal out of during the first and the second elections. So he has a white mother, he has a black father. So there's already a part of the mindset of America where there's certain value given to him based on the fact that his mother is white. There's a certain level of you know, he's got a little something extra versus a person who has two black parents would not have. So that's part of it. But the second part, and I think the more important part, people use it as proof, well, we've elected a black man as president. But all you have to do is look at the election results. If it's a post-racial America, this America where whites have gotten over, you know, this idea of not feeling comfortable with a black person in the White House, all you have to do is look at the numbers. When he was elected in 2008, Barack Obama received 42% of the white vote. 42%. So that means 58% of whites voted against him. So that means 58% of whites did not want a black president in 2008. So that already kicks the theory to the curb a little bit. But then when you look in the second election, when he ran for re-election, he went from 42% of the white vote, he dropped down to only 38% of the white vote. So that means he went to having 62% of the whites who voted not wanting him to be the president. That, to me, does not prove a post-racial America. That proves that America is the same as America's always been. It's not comfortable with a black person being in the White House. Now, had those numbers been the opposite, had he won and had gotten 58% of the white vote in 2008, 62% of the white vote in 2012, I'll be whooping and hollering and saying it's a post-racial America. But I can't do it because the numbers don't support it. So we tell ourselves things, we live this fantasy, but we don't really analyze why we have that particular fantasy. It feels good to say we're post-racial America, based on our history, because we all know there's been a very ugly history racially. So it feels good to say, you know, we're in a post-racial America, things are so much better, and we have a black president and blah, 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 but it doesn't prove anything. I used to tell people back then, people would get mad at me. But I said, Barack Obama becoming president, you know what that meant to me? That simply meant that one more black person got a job that was looking for a job. That's all it meant. It didn't mean a whole lot more to me. I wasn't a person who was celebrating, who was on pins and needles wondering whether or not he was going to win. I thought it was wonderful because older people in my family in particular were very excited about it. My mother was very excited. I'm sure had my grandmother still been living, she would have been extremely excited. So it was a lot of excitement. For a lot of people, blacks as well as whites, were very excited about the fact that we had this black man in office. But to me, it was symbolically important. But in terms of further importance, in terms of affecting racial views, it didn't mean that much to me. And that's kind of the perspective I looked at it from. But I was very happy for all of the people who were happy for him. So acknowledging racism is very important and very difficult. Study it. We have to realize that we have to have a deep understanding of how racism works. Part of the reason I wanted to do this series was to give people an understanding of how the idea came about, and how racism works in our daily lives. Because I don't think that it's something that we're well aware of. We typically think of racism as individual acts perpetrated by people who are racist. But that's not what racism is in most cases. Racism is an institutional bias against specific groups of people. And so if you look at it from that perspective and you look at it how it's played out, and I give you guys multiple examples over the course of the past several weeks of how it's played out, you understand that it's much deeper than we've been led to believe. The next step is learn what it looks like. Once you study it, you recognize it when you see it. It's not a surprise when you see it. You're like, You look at it from a different perspective. When you've seen examples of it, when you've heard stories of people who have talked about their experiences of it, you recognize it then. It's much harder to see if you haven't grasped a full understanding of it. So you can then learn what it looks like. And once you've done that, then you're in a position to challenge it. This is a very difficult step as well. Challenging racism. Whether you're the victim of it, whether you're a bystander, it's very difficult to challenge. I've always believed, and I had a conversation with one of my cousins yesterday. We were talking about this. And I told him, I said, one of the more difficult things for white Americans to do, it's extremely difficult. We don't give enough credit to how difficult this is. It's extremely difficult as a white person to challenge racism if you're a bystander. It's extremely difficult because you risk so much. You risk losing friends and family members. There's a guy that I used to work with many years ago, a black gentleman. He was married to a white woman. And some other people that we work with told me a story about him. And I was like, man, that's really kind of crazy. But what happened was, when he married his wife, her family refused to attend the wedding. They wouldn't attend the wedding. His mom, his dad, and sisters and brothers, or her mom, dad, sisters, and brothers, all of his family attended, but her family didn't attend the wedding. And as they went through the course of the first couple of years of being married, her family was one of those families that celebrated hugely. They celebrated the 4th of July in a huge way. Thanksgiving, they had tons of people over. Christmas, all of the major holidays, Memorial Day. I mean, they would just love celebrating. And one of the big parts of their celebrations traditionally had been taking pictures. But when she married this young man, they weren't allowed to be in any of the family pictures for any of those holiday celebrations anymore. None. They refused to let her or him. They wouldn't even let her, if she came to the parties alone without him, be a part of the pictures. They felt very uncomfortable even coming to the events after a while. But it changed. And it changed because of something that you would think maybe that wouldn't change it. But what changed it was when they had their first child. When they had their first child, now the parents are grandparents. They have a grandbaby. How can you deny a grandbaby? They're so cute and wonderful and cuddly and all of those things. How can you? And so that is what changed them and started allowing the baby. The baby came out very pale skin, and it grew darker as it grew older. And I met, they ended up having, I believe, 3 children. I met 2 of their children. I met their son and daughter. The first child was a son, and then they had a daughter. I've met those 2, and the youngest, I don't believe I've met the youngest, but, very light skin, long, silky hair. But the reason I bring that up is because here we have people who refuse to participate in the lives of family members simply because they had married outside their race, as people like to say. And just think about the mindset. So they had that mindset, and then when they had a grandchild, they kind of changed their views. And really, that's one of the things about the way we interact in terms of our racial views. It's craziness when we think about it. It's absolutely insane to have that mindset, but it's very, very prominent in American society. So if you're a person who wants to step outside of that, say you were a member of her family, maybe her brother or her sister, and you wanted to say, this isn't right, we should let them participate and take the pictures, you're risking your relationship with the rest of the family who doesn't have those views. So that's very, very difficult to do. It's extremely hard to step outside and have a different viewpoint. It's very challenging. And you risk so much that you care about. You risk those friendships. You miss those relationships with family members. You risk those relationships with coworkers. And so the people that do it, I applaud people that have the courage to do it, because there's not a lot that are really, really, really up to the task of doing it, because it's so very, very difficult. But that is the 4th step, is to challenge it. And regardless of what method you use to challenge it, it's also very hard. One of the things also that happens from the perspective of victims is, at some point, you have to challenge the people that are victimizing you. You have to do it in a more vociferous way. For many, many years, people aren't really accustomed to hearing about how slavery worked and the impact that it had on the African people who were brought over. Or, more importantly, they're not well aware of the methods that the Africans used to fight against this condition that they were in. One of the first things they did once they boarded the ships, because they had no idea where the ships were going, many times they committed suicide on the ships. They killed themselves even inside the ship, or they jumped overboard and committed suicide, or threw their children overboard to kill their children. So that was one way of fighting. Another way was to try to commandeer the ship, to have a mutiny and take over the ship. In many cases, they did it successfully, but they didn't know how to drive the ship. So the ship may or may not have made it back home or made it back to where they came from in Africa, because in many cases the ship may have stopped at 5 or 6 different ports. So even if you got back to the port that the ship left from, that wasn't necessarily your home. So that was another way that they fought against it. There were constant revolts on plantations throughout the United States, Brazil, Haiti, Colombia, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, wherever these Africans were brought as an enslaved population, they were constantly fighting. Another method that they used to challenge the situation they were under was to injure themselves on purpose, to make it so that they couldn't work. And so they got the reputation of being lazy. You're being forced to work, and you decide to not work very hard, you're lazy. There was even a guy who came up with this crazy idea. He called it drapetomania. And he said this condition was a condition that enslaved blacks had. And what the condition was, he said they must be crazy when they get this condition, because what it does to them, it makes them want to run away from the plantation. They have a mental illness according to this man. Running away is a mental illness according to him. It's a way of challenging their condition. So blacks have constantly challenged their position in America and in other places where they've been the victims of oppression. And one person that did it in a way that had never really been done before. How many of you guys have heard the I Have a Dream speech before? Raise your hand.
Like what?
The I Have a Dream speech.
I guess.
I can guarantee you that a majority of you that have heard it have never heard the beginning of the speech. You've never heard the beginning of the speech, because it's very rarely ever played. You very rarely ever hear the beginning of the speech. You hear the part of the speech that wasn't even supposed to be a part of the speech. When Dr. King wrote his speech for that day, you see right here in his hand, he has a speech that he wrote. And what he did was he finished that speech the night before the March on Washington. He was giving the speech, and he stopped reading from the text, and he started talking about the I Have a Dream part. That was something that he had used before on several occasions. He had used it maybe several months before the March on Washington at a church in Detroit, where he talked about this dream that he had. So it wasn't supposed to be part of his speech. And there's a couple different stories related to why he went away from the text and went to the I Have a Dream part. One, probably the most prominent version of the story is that someone yelled to him, Martin, tell him about your dream. And so he left the rest of his speech unsaid, and he started to talk about the dream that he had. So I always like to tell people that Dr. King did something on that particular day that was very dangerous for him, that had never really been done as openly as he did it. He spoke about America in such a way that white Americans had very rarely ever heard a black person speak about America. So I want to play for you guys the beginning part of the I Have a Dream speech, because it wasn't the I Have a Dream speech. It became the I Have a Dream speech, but it was never intended to be the I Have a Dream speech.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I am happy to join with you today.
Did everyone hear?
In what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights, the whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
How many of you guys have heard that part of the speech before?
That last words,
The last sentence?
I remember hearing this promissory note thing somewhere. So.
Okay. So that's typical. Most people have never heard that part. It's amazing to me. Had Dr. King stuck to the speech that he was giving and not went into the whole thing about the dream, how many people even remember that speech? Would it be this famous speech? You heard what he was saying. It wasn't like he was saying nice stuff about America. He was basically saying that America was continuing to mistreat its black citizens and that we needed to continue to fight. That was his message that he wanted to give to those people and to the international audience that day. That was his primary message. He went on and talked about the dream, and that's the part that people remember because that's the part that people have heard. So here we have this momentous event. And I thought it was weird that this march was held on a Wednesday. On a Wednesday. Yeah. Not on a Saturday, not on a Sunday, on a Wednesday in the middle of the week. We know that a lot of those people that were there had jobs they had to get back to. The government John Kennedy administration had the leaders of the march promise that they would be out of town by sundown. Everybody. That they'd be back on their buses and out of town by sundown. They had the Army and the National Guard standing by in case something bad happened. They just assumed that something bad was going to happen. It could be a riot. So they had them on standby. And nothing happened other than good stuff. And so there were all of these wonderful feelings. Newspapers the following day wrote wonderful things about this wonderful march. But in a very short period of time, Black America realized that same old America. 18 days later, less than 3 weeks after the March on Washington, this great event in our nation's history that we celebrate every year, less than 3 weeks later, these 4 little girls were killed when their church, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, was bombed with dynamite by some members of the United Klans of America. Those 4 girls were killed, 22 other people were injured, less than 3 weeks after the March on Washington. So it was a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call for America that said, okay, the march was great, made you feel all warm and fuzzy inside, but what difference did it really make? What impact did it really have? In the minds of some people, it had no impact. And they killed those young girls. And of course, we've all heard the story of what happened to the people who bombed them. The criminal justice system made sure that they didn't suffer, that they didn't go to prison for many, many years until a prosecutor decided many years later to prosecute the 4 men who were responsible for that bombing. So, Frederick Douglass, these are to me my favorite words that Frederick Douglass ever spoke. Frederick Douglass, to me, of all American leaders that I've ever studied, he is my favorite American leader of all time. And part of the reason he is because of these specific words that he spoke in 1857. There is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one or it may be a physical one. And it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. And that last part specifically is a part that my students can tell you, they hear me say it all the time. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. If you don't fight back, it's not going to end. If you accept it, it's not going to go away. People aren't all of a sudden going to say, oh, I'm going to start treating you nicely. It requires you to do something to make it happen. It's just like a bully. In school, the bully's going to keep beating you up until you do something to stop the bully. They're not just going to wake up one morning and be a nice person and not going to beat you up anymore. It requires you to fight back in some way, shape, or form. It may be with words or with blows, but really part of what he was talking about was this explosive sentiment within America over the debate about slavery. And guess what? He was right. It came to the point where words or blows ended up being, anybody know what happened? The Civil War. The deadliest war in American history. The deadliest war. 2% of the American population was killed in the Civil War. Imagine that. This huge number of people fought in a 4-year war. And it was about the issue of slavery. It was about other issues also, of course. But the main reason, the reason, if you took this reason away and left all the others, it wouldn't have been a war. If you took the issue of slavery away, all the other issues combined would not have been enough to have the nation have a civil war. So he talked about the necessity, if you are the victim of oppression, the victim of racism, the necessity to fight back. Carter G. Woodson wrote a little book called The Miseducation of the Negro. Carter G. Woodson is the founder of what we call Black History Month. He started Negro History Week in 1923 as a way to celebrate the contributions blacks have made to world history, because it was never talked about in any of our schools. So he wanted to gather the information, have other scholars gather the information, start to put it in the textbooks, teach it in the schools, and he said eventually we won't have a need to have a celebration, but that's never happened. But he wrote these words about what happens when you are in an oppressive society, what happens to your mind, how you can then be controlled. He said, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary. So the roles that we play, we learn those roles. We're taught to play specific roles within Manishan psychology. And so most people fit in very nicely with those. Some people don't. Some people will not go to their proper place. And those people who don't go to their proper place, those are the ones that make a difference. Those are the ones that make a change. People like Dr. King, Malcolm X, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, they were not going to go to their proper place. Those whites who fought alongside blacks as abolitionists during the populist movement, during the civil rights movement, all of those whites who risked everything they had, including their lives, were people who were not going to stay in their proper place. They were going to fight the status quo, and that's something that's absolutely positively necessary if you're going to make progress against racism in America. So, managing racism. Most of the next part of the presentation, or a big part of it, after I'm going to show a few film clips, comes from this book called The Many Costs of Racism by Professor Joe Fegan and Karen D. McKinney. Outstanding book. It covers the impact that racism has, and then it goes into fighting against it, what you can do. So these are some of the things that they talk about when you're going to fight or manage everyday racism, because it's something that's there all the time, so you have to manage it. You can't fight it, you can't win all the time, but you have to manage it every day. Learn how your friends, family members, and others have coped with racism. Study the lives and battles fought by people like Dr. King, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dick Gregory, Stokely Carmichael, and many others have coped. Because they've written their accounts of how they cope with racism, how they were able to manage and deal with it on a daily basis, and some very provocative things that they had to say about their battles. In addition to that, you have to assess the situation and evaluate the strategy you feel fits. You have to choose your battles. You don't win every battle. You have to choose your battles very carefully. In addition to that, you have to learn how to shield yourself from racism so that it doesn't break you down. And you have to educate yourself and others as well. So what can bystanders do? What can bystanders do? I've talked at great length about whites who are bystanders, who witness acts of racism. Most times they don't do anything because they're afraid of losing something. But some do. So what can they do? And we'll see, there's 3 quick film clips I'm going to show you. Situations, and you see how the white people in it reacted to it. They may have been a bystander, or they may have been a perpetrator of racism, but just kind of listen to the dialogue in terms of what these people noticed. So these are some methods of fighting racism. One is to recognize white privilege. White privilege is this idea that's been around for a while, and it basically talks about the privilege of having white skin in America. Little or none of white privilege is maintained by blatant racists. Rather, institutional structural mechanisms and public policy maintain it both materially and psychologically. Moreover, white privilege is shared by all whites, affluent and poor, albeit to varying degrees. White skin privilege is usually less a matter of direct, referential, and snarling contempt than a system of protecting the privileges of whites by denying people of color opportunities for asset accumulation and upward mobility. So let's watch this film.
A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Amir. hey, get on stage, you make your jokes about white people, you say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. They're like, well, you do that, Amir. You do that. You get on stage, you make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's reverse racism? I said no. I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism, and I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I'd do is I'd get in my time machine, I'd go back in time to before Europe colonized the world, right? And I'd convince the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources, set up some kind of, like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China. Just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where black and brown people come from. But of course, in that time, I've made sure I set up systems that privilege black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. The white people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Just every couple of decades make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age and say it's for their own good because their culture's inferior, and just for kicks subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty so they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes and hair. If after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism.
One of the more common ideas out there in terms of people combating the idea of anti-racism is to talk about reverse racism. It's an absolute joke to me. I mean, I understand people's perspectives, but I think this guy articulated it quite well. Why reverse racism is just, it's nonsense. The whole idea of it is nonsense. You may or may not agree. But let's watch this next clip. Double standards. Double standards.
White boy who walks in the room and is animated and moving around and maybe even a little cheeky is smart. And isn't he smart? Isn't he cheeky? He's almost looked at as, well, boys will be boys. A boy of color, especially an African-American boy who walks in the room exhibiting the same behavior, walks in and says, I might need to keep an eye on him. We are afraid of these young boys, and I'm talking young boys, 4 years old and above, and that instead of the teacher looking at him or herself and saying, what is going on with me, that this same behavior creates fear in me instead of admiration, we pathologize the boy of color.
Jump shot.
No, look, I want to get over there.
Dance.
No, listen, I need to get over there.
Crack.
No, I'm sorry, look, I just want to get over there.
Rap.
No, I need to get over there.
Hey man, show me your jump shot. Show me your jump shot.
There was no place for us in school. I would argue that the greatest waste of time in my life was the 4 years I spent in high school. And this is coming from an educator. That there was, from the food we were fed to the only way we were really accepted in school, you know, black boys are the mascots of any high school that they're in where I grew up. I don't know about other places. I've seen it in other places though. I see it now at universities. Well, like these black dudes are, you know, they're the provocative part of your experience in high school or college or in the workplace, you know. And for me, it didn't speak to me. Race always deals with boxes, right? And I think when we are, so let's say you grow up in the suburbs, you know, or you grow up in an affluent area in a city that has an affluent area and a ghetto, but you're black, a black boy. And you get to school and there's a box for you, and that box says you rap, you're an athlete, you're slightly to highly misbehaved, you're not involved or into your education that much, you sell and or use drugs. That's the box that you're accepted in. And in order to play ball, no pun intended, that's how you interact with yourself, your own identity, and this is how you're cool. But you feel like the box that it traps you in is you feel like to be healthier, to be in a more sound mind state, to think and know and come from a place of foundation in your life, is something that you have to be ashamed of and you have to denounce. Can drive you crazy.
That's a documentary, Cracking the Codes. I highly recommend that you guys take the opportunity to see it. They have a website, Cracking the Code, crackingthecodes.com. Very good website, a lot of great information, series of very provocative questions about just racism and how we interact with racism as Americans. It's very, very well done. I highly recommend it. One of the other things I think that's really important from the perspective of bystanders or whites in particular is to really be introspective, to kind of look at your lives in a way that people typically don't want you to look at your lives, to kind of look outside of the world that you live in. I tell my students this all the time. The only way you can really understand who you are as a person, you have to make the world you live in bigger than the world that you live in. Many of the students that I have issues with at my school, in terms of them doing things or not being as productive as they should be, it's because of the world that they live in. It's very small. The things that they do that we consider to be counterproductive, that are hurting them, not allowing them to have the success they want to have, those are things that they see other people around them do all the time. Those things seem to be normal to them. And the only way they understand that those things are not normal is to see the world outside of that world that they live in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I have students who've never stepped out of the city of Milwaukee in their lives. Never. They've never been to Racine, Kenosha, Madison, Wisconsin Dells, Six Flags. They live in that same little bitty world, that little bitty globe they live in, and they think that's the entire world. And so the things that they see that are normal, that are not necessarily considered normal by the rest of society, to them it's normal. And I mentioned this last week when I was here. One of the things that we do as Americans is we judge other people by our standards. We have to understand that everybody doesn't have the same set of standards we have. Based on where you are and who you are as a person, your standards may be absolutely positively different than the mainstream standards that America has for you. If you're a young child who grows up in a very poverty-ridden area where things that are unproductive, people using drugs, people drinking heavily, people using firearms, where those things are prevalent on a regular basis, those things are normal in the community that you grow up in, you think that's the way it is everywhere. And so you have no problem participating in those things because you say that everybody does that. Cursing. I think I told you guys last week, I had one of my students told me the day before the end of school, I heard this girl cursing in class. I said, you know, you shouldn't use that type of language. She said, Mrs. Jackson, everybody talks like that. That's like, no, they don't. I don't talk that way. And so, in the world that she's from, that little bitty world that she's from, that's normal. And so, there's a small, little bitty world that people tend to live in, and it's hard to get outside of that. But for whites, their world, as I showed you guys last week, with the social isolation that whites have. I showed you guys in almost every county in the state of Wisconsin, whites make up nearly almost 100% of the population in all but just a handful of counties. So if you live in a county that only has 3 black people in it, just 3 in the whole county, what are your perceptions of blacks based on? Will it be based on those 3 black people who you may or may not have ever even seen? Or will it be based on what you see on television, in the movies, on the news, in the books you read? That's where your perception comes from. So you have this misaligned perception of what black people are like because it's based on what Hollywood tells you black people are like. And as a result, you react to blacks as if that's who they are. That's how they act. You don't realize it's not the truth. You don't realize you have to get outside of that world that you live in and explore some other parts of America. So what ends up happening, you get stuck in this idea where you're very uncomfortable talking about being a white person. It's very, very uncomfortable. But these are the people that were willing to do so.
I don't have any trouble admitting that I'm a racist. I think it's absurd to try to fight with that. I grew up in this society. I was conditioned by it. I think internally in my psyche, I've grounded and rooted those attitudes, and I see it in me all the time.
I don't like being a white man, and that's where I still am and working on that, because I know what I've done, what people like me have done.
Part of being white is just not in any way acknowledging what it means to be white.
I have a white skin, and that with that white skin comes along a whole mess of privileges that I have, and I don't ask for them, they just are there.
You have started to break the code of silence a little bit, and you start talking about white people, and you start talking about this stuff, and you find yourself suddenly all alone.
Family history, as I understand it, was really, people coming to America as a way of searching for a better life and escaping poverty. It has often seemed to me that also meant escaping their roots, where they came from, that there was a sort of a desire to separate from that and to become something different.
That I have Scotch-Irish ancestry with a little bit of German. I'm European, and I came over 250 years ago.
My ancestors are from England and Germany.
My ancestors are German and Russian and Scottish.
In my father's side, it was Irish, and my mother's side, it was probably English, but I don't know a lot about her side.
I'm French Indian. I guess you'd say I got a little Cajun in me.
So do you identify as Irish?
No, not really. I identify
wasn't American. British, Scotch-Irish. Scotch, that's where my ancestors are from, supposedly, but it hasn't had any impact on me. Doesn't mean anything.
I think pilgrims. When I think of where did I come from, I think pilgrims, but no. But I'm sure somewhere down the line I am.
Because they were Irish, there was a lot of oppression, you know, because they immigrated over from Ireland. So I thought a lot about what that was like for them as Irish people, but I never thought about what it was like for them and when they became white.
Well, you can only be something if there's something else to negate it. So I guess we became white. I guess we're white because there's a bunch of other races to set us off.
How did English people and German people get turned into white?
Came to America.
By assimilation, by living, by living in the U.S. It's just the smorgasbord, you know.
I have no idea. I honestly have no idea.
Do you know how they got turned into British and Scotch people? How those people got turned into white people?
No.
You ever thought about that?
I'm not a history buff. I think culture did that over time. It's like certain words that we use in our language are not our words, or other nations, other words that come from other languages.
Yeah, how did the Irish get turned into white people?
That's a good question.
I think a lot of it was early assimilation in the United States, a lot of European ethnics coming over, assimilating for a variety of reasons. Primary one being a desire to elevate their socioeconomic status. So to get jobs, to find places to live, a lot of the Europeans altered their last names to sound more mainstream. A lot of them changed the clothing that they wore, the foods they ate. So there was some way call it assimilation. I think of it more as Anglo-conformity, conforming to this kind of dominant white culture.
But the reality is that those persons who are white and who are considered white and treated as such in this society, by virtue of being white and treated that way, have had to give up who they really were. If they were Russian American, my father's side of the family, grandfather's side, great-grandfather came here from Russia in 1910. He had to give up what it meant to be a Jew, a Russian Jew from Eastern Europe, to become an American, which really meant to become white. The Irish had to do the same thing. The Italians had to do the same thing. The Greeks had to do the same thing. All these European ethnics who were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants had to give up their actual identities for the sake of whiteness.
I really didn't think about being white, I'd say, growing up, because mainly, I think because I was part of the majority and I maybe wasn't forced to think about it.
I don't think it means anything. It's just, some people might think it means better, but to me it doesn't mean anything but just the color of my skin, really.
How often do you think about being white?
Not very often. I really don't think about it a lot at all.
Hardly ever. It's just me.
Racially, do you see yourself as a white person?
No, I see myself as a person.
So, do you ever think about being a white person?
No.
Probably not very often.
Not really. Sometimes I got a lot of black friends. Sometimes we make jokes about it and everything, but not really. It doesn't matter to me whether I'm white, pink, or purple, or black. I don't care.
Depends on the social situation. Sometimes I'll be the only white person in the room when it's reversed, when the tables are sort of flipped.
How do you identify racially? Do you see yourself as a white man?
I think that everybody is equal in the eyes of the Lord.
So you don't see yourself as a white person?
Not as much as most people. I think when it's all said and done, we're equal, and definitely inside and outside.
But I don't know if I ever considered myself white or thought about it. At one point I'm sure I did, but I don't really have any recollection of when it was, which I think is a total reflection of whiteness, of never having to sort of contemplate why people treat you the way they do.
To be white means to be a member of a dominant racial group in a society that I'd consider white supremacist. And to be white in a white supremacist society, not just a racist society, because that's almost too generic. To be white in a white supremacist society is to be able to have the luxury of oblivion, to be oblivious to the injustices, to be oblivious to racial privilege, to be oblivious, frankly, to one's own identity. So it is, in a sense, to be invisible to oneself.
Well, I think to be white in this culture means to deny the reality of racism. And it means to deny the privilege that we have as whites. Most people who are whites don't want to accept that they are privileged because they are.
People don't want to talk about being white because they know that at a deep level, even though they haven't even, some of them may not have ever talked about it with anybody or ever expressed it, they do know that they get a benefit from being white.
If you're white in this country, there's certain advantages that come your way, and it doesn't really matter whether you want to or not, or whether you're in touch with it or not.
No, I know there are privileges that I enjoy simply because I'm white.
Every minute of my life, I'm aware of my white privilege, of the fact that I have a white skin, and that with that white skin comes along a whole mess of privileges that I have, and I don't ask for them, they just are there.
There are things that come to me, that belong to me, that I'm given and that I expect just because I'm white, that I never wonder about, ask about, discuss. And that's the power of it, is that the privilege of expecting that I'm going to go to good schools and that I'm going to have choices no matter what, that there will always be a choice that will be probably pretty reasonable, that will work out pretty well for me.
To me, it's about privilege. A lot of people get to walk around thinking that we live in a meritocracy and thinking that their own hard work is the only thing that's, responsible for their achievements. I think that it means, it has, and I think that it shapes everything.
White privilege is probably the freedom to move through the world fearlessly in a way that black people cannot move through the world. That you can take advantage of opportunities with much less fear and an assumption that you'll be treated equally with all other white people.
Part of it is not having to even think about it. And so in a way, it's sort of like the privilege of having that space in your mind free to think about other things and be concerned about other things. So it's not even having to think about race is part of the privilege.
White privilege is being able to walk into a department store and not be followed by the detective.
A friend of mine who's Asian American, she was very unfairly treated at a department store. She was at a cosmetics counter, and she had bought something and it came with a free gift. So the woman at the counter put the free gift in the bag, and my friend didn't know that the free gift had already been put in the bag, so she had grabbed the one on the counter and put it in the bag unknowingly. Just as the sweetest woman, wouldn't hurt a fly. And they called the cops on her, and she was taken to jail and arrested. I put myself in the same position that she was at, and I know there's no way I would have been arrested. I know I would not have been arrested.
It's the assumption that when you go to buy a car that you're going to have the money. Well, it's the assumption that when you go into a real estate office looking for a place to rent, unless you wear raggedy clothes, it's that you're going to want to go into this nice neighborhood
You basically get to say what you want to, be any way you want to. You get privilege. You don't have to work as hard. You can slack off in jobs and still get promoted and still not have to worry about somebody coming after you. So whiteness to me is about privilege and access to information systems and people and power that you didn't earn.
I went through a time where I was poor and I had to take care of my father, and I worked with about 100 African American men, and I was the only white male on the shop floor. And I was really horrible at this job. It was a metal grinder. I'd grind too much of it. I'd make big indentations. I was constantly messing up, and I was sure I was going to get fired. It was just a matter of time. And about 6 months into the job, the boss and a few of the managers come over. They're all white men, and I thought, this is it. This is the day I'm getting fired. And they came over and told me that they've had their eye on me and they think that I'm management material. I said, what? And they said, yeah, you stick around for a while and we think you've got potential to be a manager here.
It's all embedded in every piece of our country. It's embedded in every structure that we have. It's embedded in our economics. It's embedded everywhere.
When I walk into a bank, or when I walk into anybody's neighborhood, or when I walk into anybody's store, that I'm acceptable, that I can go anywhere I want, and I'm seen as an acceptable person. And the reason I am acceptable is because I'm white.
I remember when I was going to get my driver's license renewed for the first time. I really couldn't see very much without glasses. I didn't have any glasses with me. They had you go to one of these machines you look in and see like what letter it is and etc. I couldn't see any of it. I was one of the few white people there, and the guy behind the desk was this older white guy, and he just said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Go ahead." I was like, "Is he just letting everybody through?" And I saw that he wasn't, and I kind of was like, "Oh, okay."
It's the ability to walk into the bank in Savannah when we were ready to build our house and borrow $100,000, and neither one of us were working. I mean, that to me, that is just so incredible that we could do that. I mean, of course we had to present, we had to give them facts and figures and all that kind of thing, but if you were a person of color and you walked in and you said, well, we're neither working and they're going to loan you $100,000, I don't think so.
Oh, simple things. I mean, from everything from the ease of getting a bank loan to knowing that I can drive just about anywhere in the city and not get stopped because of my color by the police.
When I drive down the road and I get pulled over by a police officer, it's probably because either I've broken the law or I'm getting a flat tire and the police officer's going to tell me I'm getting a flat tire.
Well, when I get pulled over, I don't get tickets, I'm a white woman, middle class, and a minivan. I get pulled over all the time for speeding. And it's almost become a joke. And then, the police officers apologized to me for pulling me over, and I know if I was a person of color, that wouldn't happen, I know that I would be pulled over a lot more if I was a person of color because I speed every day. And so I get stopped, they look at my license, and then they let me go,
I've experienced whiteness on the 3 occasions that I've been pulled over by law enforcement driving a car. One time I ran a red light, it was turning red, right? Another time I was speeding, and another time I had a headlight out. And every single time I got off with a warning. I never got a ticket for any of those things. It was privilege and whiteness, therefore, that helped get me off. And I think for the average person, it would be whiteness that would allow me not to even have to think about why. I could get away and thinking, oh, I sweet-talked my way out of that. I did, but I was aided by the fact that I'm white.
They're not going to do a body check on me. They're not going to rip my car apart looking for a reason to haul me in. I'm not profiled. That's white privilege.
Basically, when I go to city council or county commission, I expect my representatives to take me seriously. And And they do, for the most part, because they know that they have to be more accountable to the white community because the white community has more power and money and can vote them out of office.
We as white people have a sense of what our rights are, that we have the right to, live well, live safely, have health care and police that respond to us, have city officials that pay attention to us, have, the needs of our community, be able to have those met. And I think that if you talk to people of color or look at communities of color, that does not exist for people.
I really enjoyed that documentary. There's much more to it than that, but it's very rare for people to ask white people to even have a conversation about being white. To ask them what does it mean? How did you become white? What does it feel like to be white? What are some of the advantages of being white? It's just one of those conversations that never ever comes up, ever. And to me, that's part of the reason that racism persists. Because really, in order to believe that racism exists, to really honestly believe it, to realize that it has this huge impact, you have to be honest about the privileges that you have by being a white person. I'll give you an example. This is about maybe a month and a half ago. My mother-in-law is in her mid-70s. She lives in Brown Deer, Wisconsin. Has a Mercedes. And so she was on her way to church with one of her best friends, my father-in-law, and the police pulled him over. And she's like, what the heck are they pulling me over for? So the police officer came up to the car and asked her for her papers. And she had everything, her insurance papers, driver's license, all that stuff, registration. There were no issues with any of it. So he went back to his car, he ran her license, came back, handed it to her, got back in his car and left. Didn't have a conversation with her. Didn't say, I pulled you over because of this, or your tail light. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her over, asked her for her license, registration, and insurance, checked it, came back, gave it to her, got back in his car, and drove off. And she's sitting there like, what just happened? What just happened? It's amazing how things like that seem so small and so trivial, but they really have a huge impact, because that's something that you as a person who suffers a situation like that, you wonder, what did I do wrong? What was I doing? I was just, as people say, driving while black. And in certain communities, it's not acceptable. Let's move on. So when people are the victims of racism, there's a process that they can go through called internal coping, where you learn to cope with racism. You can't make it go away. You can't make it stop. You can't make the people that are doing the things stop doing the things they're doing. So you have to figure out ways of coping with it, dealing with it. So there are some methods you can use. One is being prepared, expecting it. Every time I get in my car and I see a police officer behind me, I expect to get pulled over. I expect to every time, because I've been pulled over so many times in the past for no apparent reason. I expect it. I'm surprised when I'm not. So being prepared for it. Trying to be desensitized. Just accepting that racism is around. It's just the way things are. Just accepting it and saying, you know what, it is what it is. Avoiding internalization of frustration, anger, and bitterness. Not letting all of that stuff get to you and turn you into this crazy person. All of that internal stuff that's just makes you want to just blow up. Not allowing it to make you blow up. Avoiding the internalization of negative images. We see so many negative images of ourselves, whether it be Native Americans. I just had a discussion with some people last week about the football team in our nation's capital and their nickname, which I'm not going to say. And it was interesting how some people said, well, they didn't have a problem with the name. I don't have a problem with the name. It's not offensive to me. And I said, that's not offensive to you? Is it not offensive because you're not a Native American? Or is it just not offensive? Even if you were a Native American, would it be offensive to you? If I was a Native American, it wouldn't be offensive to me, this one guy said. Like, okay, so if they change the name of the Green Bay Packers to the Green Bay Blackskins, would you be offended? Or they change the name of the Milwaukee Brewers to the Milwaukee Yellowfaces, would that be offensive to me? Yeah. But the name of the Washington team doesn't bother me. Maybe it does. It's things we don't think about. And that can drive you absolutely crazy if you accept those negative images. Knowing oneself, you have to know who you are. You have to know yourself. You have to kind of go inside of who you are and understand who you are in order to cope with it. I've been able to cope with it successfully. People always ask me, why is it that you're always talking about this stuff? All of the times, the hundreds and hundreds of tours I gave at the museum, talking about these issues to people from all over the world, talking to children, adults about these issues, and I really love it. And people ask me, how can you do it without it driving you crazy, without it bothering you? Because I know who I am. I'm very confident in who I am as a person. I don't allow these things that have been internalized in so many other people. They're not inside of me. I've taken them out of my brain. They're no longer there. They may have been there years ago when I didn't understand, but as I got to know and engage myself in educating myself about these things, I was able to push those things out of me. A lot of people haven't gotten to that point, and some people never will. Framing attitudes about whites, you really have to kind of analyze how you see whites when these things happen. In addition to that, some people will cope by framing the acts as just, people are just ignorant. They don't know any better. They're just stupid. And so that's one other coping mechanism. So let's look at how being prepared works. The book that I showed you, The Many Costs of Racism, had all of these different accounts from people that the authors interviewed about all of these different situations. And so this self-employed business owner said, I face it all day, all the time. Yes, in a way. I'm prepared. Yeah, prepared is a good word because it just happens to come up. I've got something for it. It doesn't bother me anymore. I think that's when it stops bothering you, when you're prepared for it. So that's a coping mechanism. This person says, they know it's coming. I know it's going to be there, but I'm preparing myself for it. So when it does come, I'm not surprised. One of the theories that I have, that I created, just because kind of the way my brain is wired, I notice patterns. I notice patterns in all kinds of stuff. You guys ever seen the movie The Beautiful Mind before? There's this movie about this mathematician, and it's like he has mental illness, but he's seeing numbers everywhere. And I mean, he's writing numbers on papers. I'm kind of like that in a way. It's not a mental illness with me, but somehow my brain notices patterns that other people don't notice. And one of the things that I've noticed about people is that people are very consistent. Whoever you know, I can guarantee you that there's certain situations that occur and they say or they do something, you're not surprised. Because you say, I've heard her say that before. I've seen him do that before. If you start paying attention, you notice that people have a pattern. And I've always believed this. People get upset with people because they don't recognize that person's pattern. When you recognize their pattern, you expect them to do certain things. You expect them to say certain things. So it doesn't come as a surprise and it doesn't bother you. For instance, you may have a friend that has a gambling problem, right? You know he has a gambling problem. And you notice that every time someone loans him money, he never pays it back. So now, there's 5 people he's loaned money to, and now he comes to you. And he asks for money. What do you think is going to happen if you give him the money? You're never going to see it again, right? Because you are intelligent enough that you've noticed his pattern. Well, there's at least 5 other people that he borrowed money from. He never paid him back. He's probably not going to pay me back. So you notice the pattern. Or you say, well, I'm going to be nice enough, I'm going to give it to him, but I'm not going to expect him to give it back, because I'm just going to, out of the kindness of my heart, I'm going to give it to him. So, if you're crazy, you give it to him and you expect to get the money back. But if you notice his pattern, you just give it to him, and the fact that he doesn't give it back to you doesn't bother you, because, well, that's what he always does. So, if you notice patterns, you can be better prepared for stuff that happens. And when you deal with racism, it's obvious patterns with certain people. Trying to be desensitized or acceptance of the reality of racism, it can be a positive force in dealing with a hostile workplace. I want to give you guys an example of a story. I always like to share personal stuff that happened to me. I worked at a chemical company, and we were having a meeting, our department, I was an electrician, and the maintenance department was having a meeting with the guy who was like the CEO of the company. And so the company had just been purchased by this other big company from out east, and they were changing all of these different things. So the CEO was in the meeting, and he was, sharing his ideas about some things that he thought would help improve the company. And he wanted us to be on board and to pat him on the back and say, okay, that's a great idea. Well, one of the things he mentioned I thought was really stupid. So he asked us, how do you guys feel about it? I said, I don't really like the idea. Oh my goodness, why did I say that? The guy got irate. He was so upset that I had the audacity to tell him that I thought he came up with a bad idea. And so I was sitting, we had a long table, I was sitting here, and he was sitting at the head of the table, just a few feet away from me. And when I told him I didn't think it was a good idea, he got upset, and he turned to me, he was red in the face, and he said, well, that's just how it's gonna be, boy. I said, what? That's just how it's gonna be, boy. And I got up from the seat, I almost felt like I did it in slow motion. And I was getting ready to strangle the man. But there's something inside of me that said, you probably don't want to strangle him. And then as I was moving, one of my coworkers jumped up and grabbed me and held me back so that I couldn't do anything to him. So that was pretty much the end of the meeting, right? So the person who was in charge of human rights, or not human rights, or human rights, but human resources, she was now in charge of human resources for the whole company, this big company that had purchased us. So she got this huge promotion. So I called her, she was out of town at a meeting. I contacted her and told her I needed to talk to her about what happened. So she called me back later that day, and I talked to her, and she came in the next day, and she asked me to come in her office to talk about it, right? So I went in her office, and we talked. And she says, well, so what do you want me to do? I says, I want you to do your job. Well, do you want an apology from him? He's willing to offer you an apology. I said, apology? I don't want an apology. He's willing to give you a written apology, or he can come to you and talk to you and give you an apology. I said, I don't want an apology. I don't want to read anything he wrote. I don't want to talk to him. I want you to do your job. She just said, okay. That was the end of our meeting. About a week later, she contacted me, and she gave me an envelope. She said, there's his apology. I said, I'm not taking that. Well, he's offering an apology to you. I don't care. I don't want his apology. I want you to do your job. So I knew she wasn't going to do a job. So I went directly to the cell phone and called the local EEOC office, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, thinking that, these are the people that help you when you fight discrimination and stuff at work. And so I discussed what happened to the person and told them, and they said, well, Mr. Jackson, sorry to tell you this, but you don't have a case. Said two things are working against you. One is that was just one incident. And secondly, the way the laws are written says that intent doesn't matter. But the way the courts have interpreted the laws, intent does matter. So you have to prove his intent to be racist. How can I prove his intent to be racist without going in his brain and taking something out of his brain to prove that his intent was to be racist? Him calling me a boy is generally accepted to be a racist term, I think, for most people, but I had to prove that was his intent. So this is what the man at the EEOC told me. So he said, basically, the way these things have been going for the last several years is that unless you can prove the intent, or unless the act is so blatant, you don't have a case. Like, oh wow, really? He said, yeah, that's just the way it is. So that was the end of it. The part that bothered me more than anything, the day that it happened, I left work early, intending to drive home, but I drove to my wife's job. And by the time I got there, I was so upset. I was in tears and my wife came out. She's crying. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. And I told my wife, I said, the thing that bothers me more than anything else is that I couldn't put my hands on him the way I wanted to. That's what bothered me more than anything, because I know the intelligent thing to do was to do what I did and handle it the way I handled it. But what I really wanted to do deeply inside of me was to put my hands around his neck and strangle him and tell him if he ever called me boy again, that I would put hands on him again. That's what I really wanted to do. And I'm not even a violent person, but it brought that side of me out. The reason I tell you that story is because people work in hostile workplaces all the time. Sometimes you can deal with it, sometimes you can't. So some people cope by doing this. This respondent said, I think to maintain sanity, you must have a certain amount of acceptance. Certainly there are just too numerous situations that you cannot do anything about. Some of those situations don't even involve you, but they're obvious to you. To try to handle all of the things that you see, I think would just be mind-boggling. And that's how it was for me at that company. After the incident, even before the incident. I think I worked at the company for another year and a half or so after this incident. I don't even remember. But I would see this guy to see you all the time. We had 2 buildings. We oftentimes, because I was the maintenance department, we have to work in both buildings, so I have to cross the street. And he would go into the labs in one side of the building and back to his office. And so we cross paths occasionally. He would speak. I never spoke to him again. I never had any reason to speak to him again. I never had any desire to speak to him again. He was trying to be friendly. He thought that, his apology, this is what I tell people about apologies. And maybe I'm wrong for having this mindset, but this is the way my brain works. I don't like apologies. I don't like for somebody to do or say something to me and then apologize for it because they have to apologize. Because it's not sincere. His apology was not sincere, because not only did he call me a boy once, he called me a boy twice. So whatever apology he had written on that piece of paper and put in an envelope, it wasn't sincere to me. He may have thought it was sincere, but I knew he was doing it because, human resources director told him to write this apology. So this is what I say. I said people say what they mean, and they mean what they say. So for some people, an apology works. It makes them feel better. Oh, at least they apologize. But me personally, it really just doesn't work for me. It really doesn't. Because I've always had this thought in my mind where I'll always remember things. And if I can always remember it, when I think about it, it's going to cause me pain just as it did that day. Just like I was getting a little emotional just talking about it just now. That pain, and this was years ago, is still there. It's still there. I can remember that day as if it was yesterday, as if it was earlier today. I can still remember it almost like I can see it in slow motion. So it's still there. So his apology, even if I would have accepted it, it may have made him feel better. It wouldn't have made me feel any better. So I'm not a person who accepts apologies. I'm not saying anybody else shouldn't, but apologies to me are just a bunch of nonsense.
Well, if they were sincere and you knew it, then it's different.
Well, I don't think that you can say something like that on paper to somebody 2 times and sincerely apologize. I don't think it's possible.
He has to change his mind.
That's the same as, if I was to look at, say, Jeffrey Dahmer. He killed a lot of people, right? What if he apologized to the families? Would it really make a difference? No, it wouldn't really make a difference. Because the act is there. The memories are there. They're not going to go away. So, maybe he would have had a sincere apology, but I don't want an apology. I don't need an apology. I want you to get fired for being a racist. That's what I wanted. Now, if she would have given me a letter and showed me that he was terminated or reprimanded somehow, I would have been satisfied with that. He didn't necessarily have to lose his job, but he should have been reprimanded in some way, shape, or form. But he wasn't. So, apology, doesn't mean anything to me in that situation. Let's move on. Avoiding internalization of frustration, anger, and bitterness. Frustration, anger, and bitterness. It's still with me all these years later. Some will intensely provoke a reaction. And I think that in that particular case, I don't think that he intentionally did it, but it's like a part of his brain that said, I cannot believe this man just told me my idea was a bad idea, and it just popped out of his mouth 2 times. So he wasn't necessarily trying to provoke a reaction. This is what the dentist said. He said, my son and I were riding bicycles, and we gotten off the bikes, and we were drinking out of this water fountain, and this car pulled up. These white kids drove by, and they said, hey, nigger, you know? They never stopped, but they were driving by slowly. You can't get bitter and have it consume you. This guy actually yelled at the people in the car, yeah, I'm a nigger and I'm proud of it. That was his way of kind of making it so, you said it, but it doesn't mean anything to me. Another instance I'll tell you guys about shortly of something that happened to me related to that particular word. Here's another example. A woman television broadcaster said this: you go from day to day and you wake up and you know you've got another day to face where even with where I am now, I can go into a department store and there can be 5 people waiting on. And the sales girl would invariably turn around and rather than saying who's next, will automatically go toward a person who is white. That happened to me just this past week.
Oh, that's true.
I'm at a store and I'm in line and there's one person in line in front of me, a couple people in line behind me, and I'm waiting. Person in front of me has been taken care of. So obviously I'm next. I'm getting ready to walk up to the counter. And then the person behind me just walks around me like I don't even exist. And the person at the counter helps them. And I said, excuse me? And they both looked at me, both white people, they both looked at me. I said, you guys can't see me? Am I invisible? And I took what I was about to purchase, I dropped it on the floor and I walked out of the store. And I told my wife, I will never ever, for the rest of my life, shop at that store again. That was my reaction to it. Because it was like, am I invisible? Can you guys see me? You guys all see me, right? Okay. Anybody not see me? Okay, so I'm not invisible. So obviously it wasn't there. Okay, she continues. I pull up in my Mercedes, so status symbol. I'm still just another nigger to some people in this country. And I know that, and you recognize it, and you live with it, and you tolerate it, and you try not to let it get you paranoid, and you try not to let it make you bitter. This idea of being paranoid, there's this belief among some whites, and I've heard many people say it, that black people are just paranoid. Every time something happens, you think it's race related. And it's like, you just don't get it, do you? You just don't understand. This stuff happens to us all the time. And you think we're just making stuff up, but we're not. So this guy had this to say. This right-wing analyst, Mr. D'Souza, he says this racist reality is imaginary racism. Blacks are just imagining things. Asians, Hispanics, they're just imagining things. But particularly blacks, he says. He says the first dysfunctional aspect of black culture is racial paranoia, a reflexive tendency to blame racism for every failure, even those that are intensely personal. So in other words, nothing ever happens to us as racist. We're just paranoid. We're just imagining things. And this is a very strongly articulated view among socially conservative people in America. Very strongly articulated view on a lot of levels.
May I have your attention, please? The public library is closing promptly at 8 o'clock. If you have any materials to check out, please do so now. Internet terminals will shut down at 7:55. Thank you.
As we talked about last week when I showed you guys, or a couple weeks ago when I showed you guys the images of Michael Jackson and his transformation, that this idea of these stereotypical images of blacks and how we internalize those things and we believe that certain features, a broad nose or thicker lips or our hair, something is wrong with it. People begin to internalize those things, and really it takes a lot of effort for some people to get over that. There's this other principle called stereotype threat. And what these sociologists did, they said that blacks have internalized the notion that they're less intelligent than whites. And so young children in particular, when they're given some type of assessment and they're told that this assessment is measuring your intelligence level, black children do much worse than white children do on it. If they're given the exact same assessment and not told that it's, assessing their intelligence, they do just as well or better than white children. So this idea of stereotype threat is that depending on how this assessment is worded, it may or may not adjust or may or may not affect the ability to do well on these tests. And that's a very common thing that we deal with our young people in the schools. Knowing oneself. This, as I said before, you have to shape or change your attitudes about yourself. You have to feel good about yourself. Increased self-knowledge leads to increased self-confidence. This is what Deputy Sheriff said. What you have to do to deal with that, first of all, you got to have it instilled within yourself that I'm better than whatever any man, woman, or boy or girl thinks about me. You got to be so self-confident. In other words, you got to be almost halfway cocky. And a lot of white people say, white guys are so cocky. But it's almost like it's a coping mechanism that we use because we realize that you have to be super confident. You have to present yourself as super confident, even over the top confident, in order for white people to think that you have the ability to do this, that, or the other. And so that's a coping mechanism that people use. A government administrator added, some of these children's parents don't instill that, talking about self-esteem, but it does not necessarily have to be a parent or relative. It can be anybody in the community that helps develop that child's self-esteem. I've heard some of my students say that, Mr. Jackson, we ain't as smart as white kids.
No.
I've heard that numerous times. We can't do this. We ain't like no white kids. We can't get this system. You're going too fast. I've heard that numerous times in my 5 years as a teacher. It's instilled in their brains. Framing attitudes. Yeah, I've met some good white people out here who have kept me from becoming bitter because I realize it's not just genetic. They're not all born that way. There's some good people and that they're capable of change. That's kept me from being bitter because I've seen black people be so destroyed by racism in the sense that they become so bitter they can't function anymore. Framing white acts as ignorance. Another method is to attribute stereotyping and prejudice to ignorance rather than intentional antipathy. Just say, oh, they're just ignorant. They just don't know any better. They just don't know any better. Here's what a college student did. He says, first I analyze it. I don't get irate. I never really go off on anybody. If it's something I think I can address, I address it. But if it's something so stupid, I take pity for the other person. And I get upset that they think they're so much better. I just give someone a stupid look or just say something like, that was very uncalled for, or I don't have the background to handle their problems. Just some active behavior strategies. First step in taking action is recognizing one has every right to be upset. You have the right to be upset. There's nothing wrong with being upset when you're discriminated against. You should be upset. Direct verbal or physical confrontation, going through formal organizational channels, which I attempted to do without any luck in that situation. Using humor, relying on the support of others. I'm going to skip through a few of these because there's a video I want you guys to see. Verbal confrontations, directly and firmly confront a discriminator, assertively making a statement on your behalf, putting discriminators on the defensive. And this law professor talked about how he's really tired of being the bigger man in the situation. He doesn't feel he has to do that. And so watch this very short video. It's very good.
My sister-in-law.
It's about 2.5 minutes.
Who's half black, half white, but looks white. Blue eyes, whiter than most white folks. Very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's the wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day, and Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who's a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming from her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. Oh. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. And now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over, and she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy, because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point, the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here's what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege, and even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
The woman in the video, her name is Dr. Joyce DeGruy. She wrote a fabulous book called the Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Outstanding book. Highly recommended. She does a lot of talks about race and racism and how they play out. Very similar to what I've done in terms of having discussions about it, articulating different ideas about it. And the thing that I want to leave you guys with at the end of all of these presentations I've done, where we've gone through the concept, the idea of race and where it came from, where we've looked at the different types of racism, interpersonal racism, institutional, structural racism, where we looked at the history of racism in America and how different groups have been impacted by it, how we looked at the psychological effects of racism, the impacts on the victims, the impact on the victimizers, and then tonight a discussion of just a few small things that can be done in terms of anti-racism work. I want to leave you guys with this important idea. The reason that I do what I do this in service to a man that I met, Dr. James Cameron, the founder of American Black Holocaust Museum. He survived the lynching as a 16-year-old kid in Marion, Indiana in 1930. And he was left with so much anger inside of him, but eventually he got to a point where he was able to reconcile the anger. He was able to let it go to a certain extent. He said he would never forget what happened, but he was able to kind of offer forgiveness for the things that had happened. His 2 friends being killed, him nearly being killed. And even though he was able to do that, and that was part of the process of the museum, part of the goal of the museum, to get people to think in those terms, he would always talk about how, as America, we need to be one single and sacred nationality and come together and get over all of these different issues. But he said the only true way to do it, and I completely agree with this, is to explore the past, is to make ourselves aware of how things work, how we've gotten to where we are. And that's what I hope I've been able to do with you guys, is to kind of bring you guys to a place where you have a greater amount of awareness of these issues that we've talked about. Not to the extent that I want people to be angry about it, because I'm angry about things that happen to me personally sometimes. Sometimes I can use, I look at it, some things are ironic. I'll give an example of an irony of this one woman who thought that what she was doing was going to hurt my feelings. So it was December, there was an ice storm in Milwaukee. One of my best friends and I were in my car. We had stopped at a light getting ready to turn onto the freeway, and the car behind us slid and slammed into the back of my car. Not really hard, but slammed enough, and then pushed us out into the intersection. So, we got out and we pulled over, and this young white woman was driving the car. And so, we were discussing, there's really not much damage, but let's exchange, our information, driver's license, insurance, all that. So we had done all of that. We'd had that discussion. I said, I may call my insurance company, I may not. She said, she may call hers, whatever. It was pretty much over, right? So then she started to say that it was my fault that she hit my car. And I'm like, I said, how is it my fault? What were you sitting in the middle of the street doing? I said, I was stopped at a red light. You shouldn't have been sitting in the middle of the street like that. I said, it was a red light. What did you want me to do? Run the red light. So she got very belligerent with me. Then she jumped in her car. She made a U-turn, and she yelled out of her window. She rolled her window down, and she yelled out, excuse my language, but effing nigger. And right at the time that she was saying this, a police car was pulling by. And I flagged the police down, and I told them what happened. And I said, the ironic thing about this woman doing this and then driving away from the scene of the accident, she'd already given me a driver's license and insurance information. So I gave it to the police. It's like, really, lady? You're that jacked up in the head to blame me? But it's little things like that that impact the lives of people in small, subtle ways, what I call microaggressions. And those microaggressions are oftentimes things that we witness. All of us have witnessed these little microaggressions happening to people. We've witnessed people being discriminated against in a store. We've witnessed people making racial jokes and laughing about it. We've witnessed all kinds of stuff that's just like not right. But what we have to do in order to really make these things stop being so prominent, we have to be willing to speak up. We have to be willing to give up whatever it is that we have that we feel we're going to lose by speaking up. I've done it many times. I used to be at my job, the job where the guy called me boy. I was known as the activist. They would call me the activist, as I was always speaking up for different people, because people who aren't around are the ones that get talked about. So the gay guy wasn't there, they're talking about gay people. The Asian guy wasn't there, they're talking about Asian people. The Mexican guys weren't there, they're talking about the Mexican guys. So I would always speak up for people. And I'm sure that when I wasn't there or any other black people, there's a time to say, the black jokes. But I was always a person that was always offended by racial jokes, sexist jokes. That stuff always offended me. I've never enjoyed hearing those types of jokes because to me it's unfair. If you're going to say a joke like that, say it to the person. They may find it funny too. I doubt it, but they may. So if you're willing to say this joke, say it to their face. See how they respond, because if you're saying it and then you say, well, they're not going to be offended, how do you know if you're not saying it to them? The same way with the name of the Washington football team. I heard some people on ESPN, well, there's just a handful of people that are offended by it. And then I looked into it, because obviously they have all of these resources at ESPN, and they didn't look. And there's the Oneida tribe has been pushing to get that name changed, and they just issued a report in January, like maybe 100 and some odd pages, listing all of the reasons they're offended by this name and by Native Americans being used as mascots for other, sports teams. And I'm thinking to myself, if I could find this very easily and quickly in a minute on Google, why is it they couldn't find it and have that discussion? Why is it that they're having this discussion for a whole week and I don't see a single Native American as part of the discussion? You got experts, you want to talk about, the Aaron Hernandez being arrested for murder. You bring on your legal experts on ESPN and they discuss the legal ramifications of such and such and so and so. The Donald Sterling incident, they bring on the attorneys to discuss blah, 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 blah. But here you have this issue with the Native Americans. Who are the experts? Native Americans probably, right? Not a single one is called as an expert. So we have to get past this what I call dodging the issues. We have to really be willing to confront these things head on. And it may cost us, but if you really believe, like I do, in social justice, if you honestly believe in it, then you're willing to step out on a limb and, you know, defend people who don't have a voice to defend themselves or don't have the ability to articulate those things. It's something that we all have to do in order to really make the place we live in a normal place, because America is not a normal place. It's just not normal. I was fortunate enough when I was in the Navy to travel to many different countries around the world and to see a lot of different cultures, and people just aren't uptight like Americans are. We're just the most uptight people in the world. Everybody just walks around, lives their lives, and they're peaceful and happy and they're smiling. Americans, we're just upset about all kinds of stuff. Unnecessary stuff. It's like, really? I mean, we're arguing about that again? So, you know, maybe if we change things in terms of how we relate to one another, man, we could be a lot happier people. That's what I want us to be. I want to be around happy people. Happy people. And I hate that song, Happy, because I'm tired of hearing it. But I like the idea behind it. And so I'm hoping that these presentations give you guys some of the tools that you need to kind of move forward in your efforts to either educate yourselves or fight, whatever you may be doing with this information. I'm glad that you guys were willing to come and spend some time with me. And I'll be back, I don't know when, but I have some, like I was telling someone earlier, there's certain issues that I really would like to delve in a lot more detail that I think are really important parts of us kind of understanding these things. And so I'll talk with Jessica, and over the course of, you know, whatever amount of time it may be, I'm sure I'll be back to share some more information with you. One of the things that I want to do as well, all of the presentations I've done thus far have just been me talking and you guys listening and sharing occasionally. I want to have a presentation that's a group discussion. I know people are reluctant to talk about these things, but I think that people have these views that they would like to articulate. And I always say this, I do not have a problem with somebody having a viewpoint that differs from mine. I've never had an issue with that. I believe very strongly in agreeing to disagree and disagreeing without being disagreeable. I love those types of conversations because those are honest conversations. And I know just from my experience of talking to whites about racism in particular, there are a lot of issues whites have with the way we talk about racism. A lot of people feel that a lot of fingers are pointed and that they don't really get to articulate their views without someone calling them a racist. I think those are the types of conversations we need to have so that we can really, you know, move forward. I do have, and I don't know if Jessica was able to make copies of some of the resources that I used. So there's a list on the table of some of the books that I used in the presentations that I put together. Some really outstanding books. I think if you guys read them, you'll get a lot out of them. Probably, to me, the one that's on that list that I think is probably the best, the two best. One is called When Affirmative Action Was White. Outstanding book. Absolutely. It'll change your views of how white America sees itself in terms of as this meritocracy, where they've gotten all the things they've gotten because of merit. You'll see very clearly that that's not the case by reading that book. It's an outstanding book. It talks to you about programs that were designed to be colorblind programs and ended up being the exact opposite, and really help whites to get where they are in terms of the economic status that they have in middle America. And another one I think is really powerful is the book on Christopher Columbus called the Indian Holocaust. It gives you great details about the Native Americans who were living in America when Columbus showed up, what they were doing before he showed up. Absolutely fascinating reading. And then some of the most horrific stories you'll ever hear in your life in terms of some of the things that happened to those people once the Spaniards and the Portuguese arrived. I mean, it's unbelievable. to see what happened to those people. Basically, when Christopher Columbus mistakenly ran into an island off the coast in the Bahamas in 1492, the people that were in North, Central, and South America, within about 100 years of first contact, a little over 100 years, 95% of those people were gone. You read how it happened, why it happened. It's absolutely fascinating story. And a story that I think if people really knew that story, nobody would ever name any sports team and have a Native American as a mascot again. They would never do it. They would understand how crazy it is to do so. You know, we've been raised with cowboys and Indian movies, John Wayne, the hero, and you guys, I think I mentioned this last week, Lone Ranger and Tonto. I told you my father-in-law has found some channel that shows all these old shows, and I found out that Tonto in Spanish means stupid. So Lone Ranger is stupid. I never knew that. And I was watching it and I was like, he really does sound kind of stupid the way they have him talking. And I've had Native American friends over the years. I've never heard any of them talk in that way. So I advise you guys to just kind of look at the list, and I'm sure some of those you may be able to find in the library. If not, I'm sure the staff will be able to find them for you. But I want to thank you guys again. It's been my pleasure these past couple months coming out and visiting with you, sharing the stuff that's up here with other people. It's a fascinating journey for me, and it becomes even more fascinating by meeting new people that are interested in these things, because I know most people aren't. Nobody wants to talk about racism. I mean, it's nobody. It's hard. So I understand, and I appreciate you guys coming, and I hope to see you in the future. Hope so too. I will be back.
Have you ever had a discussion where you brought in the religious aspect of it? How religious people
My goodness.
cannot see beyond it?
There's a very good book, and I didn't put it on the list. It's called Dismantling Racism. You got to read the book.
Okay, I think we have it.
Dismantling Racism.
I think the group has taken that, yeah.
Absolutely wonderful book. It looks at racism from that perspective, from the religious perspective. It's outstanding. I was reading a little bit of it as part of this presentation. So I haven't had that type of discussion in terms of looking at that. I've found that when I've had discussions with people about that, they get very angry with me. Because I tell the truth about, I've looked at the history of the Christian church and how it was intertwined with all of these things that were going on throughout American history, and even before that, the role that the Roman Catholic Church played in the destruction of the Native Americans. And it's mind-boggling to see the connections and to say, wow. And I remember one of the guys is this Catholic bishop by the name of De La Casa, became the patron saint of the Native people. He had visited some of the islands in the Caribbean, and he talked about how horribly the Spaniards were treating these people. And he went back to King Charles I, I think, and he said that we cannot call ourselves Christians and treat people the way that we're treating these people. And he convinced King Charles to stop enslaving the natives and to replace them with Africans instead. It's amazing stories, I tell you. Fascinating stories. But we've run out of time. I could talk for the next 8 hours.
I look forward to your return.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it.